Elijah woke up early as he did every day. The noise of the street outside the shelter was loud and constant, but it was a sound he had grown used to. His eyes opened to the harsh morning light, the warmth of the worn blanket he had pulled around himself being the only comfort in the small corner he occupied in the shelter. He lay still for a moment, listening to the soft rustling sounds of the other homeless people waking up too. Each person had their own story, their own set of struggles, but they all shared the same quiet hope for something better, no matter how small. He slowly sat up, feeling the aches in his body as he stretched. His clothes, though clean, were worn and frayed at the edges. A once crisp jacket now barely clung to his shoulders, and his shoes had long lost their shine. But in Elijah's eyes, the years of hardship had not broken his spirit. There was still a spark of hope that even after everything, life had something better to offer him. As the morning went on, Elijah began his routine. He walked to the shelter's small kitchen, which was often crowded with others just like him. They barely had enough food, but Elijah always made sure to leave enough for others before taking his share. It was his way of contributing to the community, of making sure that no one felt as if they were invisible. He had nothing, but he still gave what he could. It was the little things, like offering a smile to someone who was having a hard day, or listening to someone who just needed to talk, that kept his heart from hardening. Elijah's story wasn't always this way. There was a time when he had everything: family, a stable job, a future that seemed bright. He had grown up in a small town, surrounded by a loving family. His mother had always told him that hard work would lead to success, and his father had instilled in him the value of integrity. Elijah had followed that advice with determination, working his way through school and eventually landing a well-paying job. Life seemed perfect until it wasn't. One bad decision, one unlucky turn, and everything had spiraled out of control. The business he worked for shut down after a financial crisis, and without warning, Elijah found himself out of a job and out of money. He tried to make ends meet, but the bills piled up, and his savings quickly ran dry. His wife, unable to handle the stress, left with their daughter, and Elijah found himself all alone. With each passing day, the dream of a stable life became more and more distant, until one day he was forced to leave the house he had worked so hard to maintain and take refuge in a shelter. The family he had once known was no longer a part of his life, and he had no idea where they were or if they were even thinking of him. Yet, through it all, Elijah refused to give up. He could have easily fallen into bitterness, into anger at the world for taking everything from him. But he didn't. Instead, he clung to a quiet resolve. He believed that somehow, some way, life would change for him again. He had hope, even if it was a small spark, that one day he would rise from this, just as he had once risen from other struggles in his life. Every day he worked on staying strong, not just for himself, but for others. He knew that life could be hard for everyone in the shelter, and if he could make their days just a little easier, just a little brighter, then he had succeeded in some small way. Elijah wasn't a man of many words, but his actions spoke louder than anything else. In a world that had forgotten people like him, Elijah was a reminder that kindness and hope could still exist, even in the darkest of places. Sophia sat by the grand windows of her father's mansion, gazing out over the sprawling estate that stretched as far as the eye could see. The sky was painted with soft pinks and oranges as the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the perfectly manicured lawns and pristine gardens. To anyone who looked at her life from the outside, Sophia had everything one could ever dream of: money, luxury, and power. Her father, the wealthy businessman Victor Bennett, had built an empire from the ground up, and she was the heir to it all. The world was her oyster. Sophia, at 16 years old, was the picture of perfection. She had the best of everything: designer clothes, the latest technology, and a circle of friends who admired her for her beauty and status. Her wardrobe was a reflection of her privileged life: custom-tailored dresses, high-end shoes, and sparkling jewelry. She was the envy of every girl in her school, and the boys couldn't help but admire her from afar. Her flawless appearance only added to her already larger-than-life persona. She was always the center of attention, and no matter where she went, she had the best of everything. Yet, despite all of this, there was an emptiness within her that even the finest things in life couldn't fill. Sophia's life, though seemingly perfect on the outside, was beginning to feel like a beautiful cage. It wasn't that she didn't appreciate the wealth or the opportunities it provided. She did. But somewhere deep inside, she longed for something real, something genuine. Her friends were constantly with her, but often she found their conversations to be shallow. They didn't understand her struggles, her desire to find something deeper than material wealth. She was surrounded by luxury, but it felt like there was always a wall between her and the world. Everyone around her seemed to only care about what she had, not who she was. Sophia's parents, too, were distant. Her father was often busy with meetings, his mind consumed by the demands of his empire, while her mother was preoccupied with social events and keeping up appearances. Both were loving in their own way, but they were more focused on the image of the family than on connecting with her. Her father often told her how lucky she was to be born into such privilege, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they didn't really see her, just the version of her they had created in their minds. They saw her as a product of their success, someone to showcase at their galas and business events, but not as someone who needed to be understood or listened to. Sophia often found herself alone in the grand house, walking through its long corridors that echoed with silence. She would wander through the vast rooms, her footsteps barely making a sound on the expensive marble floors. The house felt cold and impersonal, a reflection of the disconnect she felt with the life that had been handed to her. She could have anything she wanted, yet what she wanted most, genuine human connection, seemed just out of reach. One afternoon, as she sat in her room reading a book, the weight of her loneliness pressed down on her. She had everything that people dreamed of, but she felt disconnected from the world outside her family's walls. Her friends were busy with their own lives, and her parents were too wrapped up in their own concerns to notice the sadness behind her bright smile. Suddenly, she noticed a notification on her phone. It was a message from one of her friends inviting her to a party that weekend. Sophia glanced at the screen, reading the invitation, but not feeling the excitement she used to. She had been to countless parties, met countless people, but it all felt the same. The fake smiles, the fake conversations, nothing ever seemed to make her feel truly alive. She sighed and put the phone down. Maybe she was overthinking it. She was supposed to be happy, to enjoy the life she had. Yet the emptiness lingered in her chest, a feeling that seemed to grow stronger the longer she lived this perfect yet hollow existence. As she stood up and walked toward the window to get some fresh air, she saw a figure outside, standing by the gates of the estate. The person was wearing a dark hoodie and appeared to be watching the house. It wasn't unusual for the security team to notice visitors or potential trespassers, but something about the figure caught Sophia's attention. She stared at them for a moment, wondering if they were just a passerby or if there was something more to it. The person remained still, not moving or approaching the gate. A shiver ran down Sophia's spine. She quickly dismissed the thought, brushing it off as nothing. But the feeling of unease lingered in her gut. She hadn't noticed anyone watching her before, and it seemed out of place. Her thoughts drifted back to the party invitation, but now she felt distracted, her mind racing with questions about the stranger. Was she imagining things, or was someone actually watching her? Little did she know, the stranger outside the gates was not just a random passerby. In fact, he had been watching her for days, studying her routine and waiting for the right moment to strike. The danger wasn't just looming on the horizon, it was already beginning to approach, and Sophia's life was about to change in ways she could never have predicted. It was a cool evening when the incident occurred. Sophia had decided to take a walk through the expansive grounds of her family's estate, hoping to clear her head. The garden, though beautiful, felt even more isolated tonight. Her thoughts wandered, trying to make sense of the unease that had been growing inside her all day. She had almost forgotten about the figure she'd seen standing by the gate, but now it lingered in the back of her mind. As she walked down the winding path near the edge of the estate, Sophia noticed something strange. The lights flickered, casting long shadows across the garden. Her heart began to race, and she quickly turned around, her footsteps quickening as she tried to convince herself that it was nothing. But then she heard it, a rustling sound from behind a cluster of trees. Her breath caught in her throat. Without warning, a man stepped out of the shadows. He wore a dark hoodie, and his face was partially hidden by a mask. The man's eyes gleamed with a cold, calculating look, and before Sophia could scream, he grabbed her by the wrist, pulling her into the darkness of the garden. The scent of danger was thick in the air. Sophia struggled, her pulse pounding in her ears, but the man's grip was too strong. Her instincts screamed at her to fight back, but her mind was clouded with fear. She tried to call for help, but the words caught in her throat. The sound of her heart thudded in her chest as the man pulled her further away from the mansion. Her only hope was her bodyguards, somewhere just out of earshot, but they wouldn't arrive in time. The man was quick, pulling her through the thick foliage and deeper into the estate, where the darkness seemed to swallow them whole. Meanwhile, across the street from the mansion, Elijah was scavenging for food in the alley. His eyes scanned the area, looking for anything that might help him survive another day. He was used to these streets, knowing the hidden corners and alleys better than most. Yet tonight, something felt different. As he crouched by a dumpster, something caught his attention, a distant, muffled scream. Without thinking, Elijah sprang to his feet. His heart raced, adrenaline coursing through his veins. He had no idea where the scream had come from, but it sounded like a cry for help. Without hesitation, he darted toward the mansion, the one place he knew was off-limits to someone like him. He knew he'd be spotted if anyone saw him, but he didn't care. Someone needed help, and he couldn't ignore that. As he neared the edge of the estate, Elijah's sharp eyes caught sight of movement in the shadows. Two figures, one of them, struggling. The air seemed to freeze for a moment as he realized it was a woman being dragged by a man, and the scene was unfolding just steps away from the mansion security gates. Sophia's face was contorted in terror as she fought to break free, but the man's grip tightened. Elijah's heart pounded in his chest. He didn't think, he didn't hesitate, he just acted. His hands clenched into fists as he sprinted toward the scene, determined to intervene. The man didn't see Elijah coming. With all the force he could muster, Elijah tackled the attacker to the ground, using his body weight to pin the man down. The man grunted in surprise, but quickly regained his footing, attempting to shove Elijah off of him. The two struggled in the grass, the sound of their grunts and scuffling filling the otherwise quiet night. Sophia, still shaken, watched the fight unfold in front of her. Her eyes widened as she saw the stranger, this homeless man, throwing himself into the fight without a second thought. The man attacking her was no small opponent, but Elijah's raw determination seemed to give him strength beyond his years. Elijah's muscles burned, his breath ragged as he fought to overpower the attacker. The man reached for a knife tucked into his belt, but before he could pull it out, Elijah grabbed his wrist, twisting it with all his might until the blade fell to the ground. The attacker hissed in pain, but didn't relent. He managed to land a blow to Elijah's stomach, causing him to stagger back. But Elijah refused to back down. With a final burst of strength, he threw the man to the ground and held him there, the struggle finally over. Sophia, still in shock, managed to scramble to her feet. She quickly ran to Elijah's side, her voice shaky as she spoke. "Thank you. Thank you so much." Elijah, his own breathing labored, nodded, his eyes meeting hers for a moment. Despite the intensity of the moment, there was a quiet understanding between them. Two people from different worlds connected in this one fleeting instant by the same struggle for survival. Before Sophia could say anything more, a group of bodyguards appeared at the edge of the garden, their weapons drawn. They rushed to her side, checking to make sure she was unharmed. One of them turned to Elijah, glaring at him with suspicion, but Sophia stopped him with a raised hand. "No," she said, her voice firm despite the shaking in her hands. "He saved me." The bodyguards exchanged uneasy looks, but they followed Sophia's lead, pulling the attacker away and securing him. One of them offered Elijah a look that mixed gratitude with wariness. Sophia, still trembling from the ordeal, turned back to Elijah. Her expression softened, and for the first time she saw him, not as the homeless man who had just risked his life for hers, but as a person. I don't know how to thank you," she said, softly, her voice shaky. Elijah's lips curved into a faint smile. "Just stay safe," he muttered, not wanting to make a big deal out of it. He had done what needed to be done, nothing more. Before he could say anything else, one of the bodyguards stepped forward, gently guiding Sophia away. "Miss Bennett, let's get you inside. You're safe now." Sophia glanced back at Elijah, her gaze lingering on him for a moment. "Thank you," she whispered again, before being led back to the mansion. Elijah stood there, watching her go. The adrenaline was still rushing through his veins, but as the weight of the situation sank in, he realized that something in him had shifted. He had saved her, but more than that, he had done something that mattered. For once, his actions had made a difference. As he turned to walk away, he couldn't shake the feeling that this moment was just the beginning of something much bigger than he could ever have imagined. The news spread quickly. A young woman, the daughter of a millionaire, had been attacked in the garden of her family's estate, and then, out of nowhere, a homeless man had come to her rescue. Sophia's father, Benjamin Bennett, sat in his office, his jaw clenched as he listened to the details on the phone. The call was brief, the words sharp. He wasn't accustomed to hearing about threats against his daughter, and the mere thought that someone had tried to harm Sophia caused his blood to boil. The man who had saved her, however, was another story. His name was Elijah, a name Benjamin had never heard before. The mere fact that he was homeless made Benjamin's temper flare. A man of such low status, acting in the way he had, felt unnatural to Benjamin. He couldn't understand why someone like that would put their life on the line for his daughter. Benjamin stood up, pacing in his office, his mind racing. He hadn't seen the situation firsthand, but he imagined it in his mind. Sophia, struggling, helpless, and then this stranger coming to her aid. There was an unsettling disconnect in Benjamin's thoughts. Why would someone like Elijah risk everything for a girl he didn't even know? His thoughts were interrupted when his wife, Evelyn, entered the room. Her expression was one of concern, her eyes filled with worry. She knew her husband's temperament all too well and could tell by his body language that he was furious. "Ben," Evelyn said softly, her voice calming, "I've spoken to Sophia. She's shaken, but she's all right. She's safe." Benjamin stopped pacing and turned to face his wife, the tension still in his shoulders. "It's not about that. It's about who saved her. I don't trust this man." Evelyn sighed, walking over to him. "I understand your feelings, but Sophia insists that he saved her life. He didn't ask for anything in return." Benjamin's brow furrowed. "I don't care. It's not right. A man like that doesn't do things out of the goodness of his heart. There must be something more to this." Evelyn placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Maybe so, but we don't know the whole story. Let's not judge until we know more. For now, I think we should focus on Sophia. She's shaken, and we should be there for her." Benjamin stared at his wife, his fists clenched. He didn't fully understand it, but he knew one thing. He needed to protect his daughter, and anyone who was involved in her safety would be scrutinized carefully. Meanwhile, far away from the $1 million estate, Elijah returned to his life on the streets. After the chaos of the night had passed and the bodyguards had escorted Sophia inside, Elijah had quietly slipped away. He didn't want to be seen. He didn't expect anything for his actions. It was just another day in his life, and he had done what needed to be done. Elijah didn't want rewards or recognition. His life had taught him to survive, to never expect anything from anyone. His survival depended on his ability to remain unnoticed and to keep moving forward. If people knew who he was or where he came from, it would only complicate things. So Elijah went back to his routine, finding shelter where he could, moving through the streets with quiet purpose. He found food when he could, talking to those who would listen and avoiding anyone who might make things more complicated. Despite the fact that he had just saved a life, he didn't feel the need to bask in the glory of it. In fact, he didn't even want to talk about it. For Elijah, this was just another moment of helping someone in need, something he had done in his past countless times. He didn't seek fame or recognition. He simply acted when it was necessary. But that didn't mean the incident would just fade into the background. In fact, it seemed to haunt him, as he couldn't shake the image of Sophia's face, the fear, the gratitude, and the way she had looked at him after the ordeal. There was something about her, something about the way she had reacted, the way her eyes met his. But Elijah pushed those thoughts away. He couldn't afford to get caught up in fantasies or emotions. He had to keep moving forward, one step at a time. The world didn't care about him, so he wouldn't waste time thinking about it. Back at the mansion, Sophia could not stop thinking about Elijah. Despite everything she had, money, luxury, privilege, she had never felt so connected to another person as she did with him. He was different from anyone she had ever met. There was no arrogance, no entitlement. He had acted purely out of instinct, risking his own life for hers. Sophia tried to go back to her normal routine, to put the incident behind her, but it was impossible. Elijah's face haunted her thoughts. She needed to find him, to thank him properly. She needed to know who he was, why he had helped her, and whether he expected anything in return. There was a sense of unfinished business, a sense that their paths had crossed for a reason. She told her father about her plan to find Elijah. "I have to find him, Dad. He saved my life. He deserves to know how much I appreciate him." Benjamin's expression darkened. "Sophia, you don't know anything about him. He's a homeless man. He's likely to be trouble." Sophia shook her head. "He didn't ask for anything. He just saved me. That's all that matters." Benjamin sighed, rubbing his temples. "You don't understand. You're the daughter of a wealthy family. People will take advantage of you. I can't just let you go after someone like that. He's probably just looking for a handout." Sophia stood her ground, her voice firm. "I'm not asking for anything from him. I just want to know who he is. I want to thank him properly." After a long pause, Benjamin relented. "Fine, but I'll be keeping an eye on things. I don't want you getting involved in something you can't handle." Sophia smiled, relieved that her father had agreed. "Thank you, Dad. I promise I'll be careful." And so the search began. Sophia, with her father's reluctant blessing, set out to find Elijah. She didn't know where to start, but she was determined. The thought of leaving her life of privilege behind for even a moment to understand the world Elijah lived in was a daunting thought. But Sophia couldn't shake the feeling that their paths were destined to cross again. Weeks passed since the fateful night when Elijah had saved Sophia's life. The days blurred together, and Elijah continued his routine, blending into the shadows of the city. Nothing had changed. He lived day by day, never expecting anything out of the ordinary to happen. But one quiet afternoon, everything shifted. Elijah had found shelter in a corner of an old abandoned building, one of the many places he frequented for warmth and some rest. The building was tucked away, hidden from the busy streets and out of sight from the world. It was far from the luxurious, pristine life that Sophia lived. As he sat there, listening to the faint noise of the city outside, he heard the unmistakable hum of an expensive engine pulling up nearby. He didn't think much of it at first. Cars often passed by, some fast, some slow. But then he heard the car stop and a door swing open. He stood up cautiously, peering through the cracked window. His heart skipped a beat as he saw the sleek black luxury car parked outside the building. The kind of car that only people with money, power, and status could afford. His mind raced. What was a car like that doing here? He tried to push the thoughts away, thinking it was just some rich person passing through. But then he saw them. A man stepped out of the car, dressed in a sharp suit, looking like he belonged in a boardroom rather than a rundown area of the city. The suit was pristine, and he moved with purpose. Elijah's pulse quickened. Something felt different about this. As the man moved closer to the building, Elijah instinctively backed away from the window, his breath shallow. The man knocked on the door of the shelter. Elijah's heart raced. He hadn't seen anyone in weeks, let alone someone from the world he had saved Sophia from. The door opened slowly, and Elijah was surprised to see a younger woman standing with the man. His eyes widened as he saw her. She looked familiar. Her striking features, the way she carried herself with grace, and the sense of confidence, he knew immediately who she was. It was Sophia, Sophia Bennett, the millionaire's daughter. His breath caught in his throat. She had come for him, but why? What was she doing here, in a place like this? He stood frozen in place, unsure of what to do, his mind racing with questions. Sophia noticed him standing in the shadows, her eyes locking onto his. A smile spread across her face as she walked toward him. The man who had accompanied her stood back, watching the scene unfold. Sophia's eyes were warm, filled with gratitude. But there was something more in her gaze, something that made Elijah feel both seen and exposed at the same time. "Elijah," she said softly, her voice carrying an emotion he hadn't expected. "I've been looking for you." He didn't know what to say. He wasn't sure if he should feel angry, confused, or touched. It was as though his worlds, his past and present, had collided in this moment. "I never thought I'd see you again," Elijah muttered, trying to keep his composure. "What are you doing here? I didn't expect this." Sophia's gaze softened. "I had to find you. I need to thank you. She paused, collecting her emotions. "I can't put into words how much it means to me that you saved my life. I sent someone to find you because I didn't want to leave things unsaid." The words hung in the air, and Elijah felt his chest tighten. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. A part of him had always feared that saving her life would be a fleeting moment, something that would vanish into the ether. But here she was, standing in front of him, not as a distant figure, but as someone who wanted to express her gratitude. "I never asked for anything," Elijah said quietly, almost as if he was justifying his actions. "I did what anyone would have done." Sophia shook her head, stepping closer. "No, Elijah, not everyone would have done that. You didn't have to risk your life. You didn't owe me anything, yet you did it anyway. And that makes all the difference." Her words hit him like a wave. He wasn't used to this kind of attention. He had lived most of his life feeling invisible, like the world had forgotten him. The idea that someone as important as Sophia, would look at him with such admiration was overwhelming. His whole life had been spent in the shadows, and now, in this moment, he was at the center of attention in a way he had never imagined. Elijah faltered, his voice low. "I didn't expect anything. I didn't expect you to come here." Sophia smiled gently. "I understand, but I want you to know something. I don't take what you did for granted. I know the world doesn't always show kindness, but you did, and I don't want to forget that." The room felt small, as if the weight of their conversation filled every corner. Elijah didn't know what to say. He had never been good with words, especially when they were meant for something so sincere. He didn't know how to process the emotion rising inside him. Sophia's presence was unlike anything he had ever experienced. She wasn't just some rich girl with everything at her fingertips. There was something genuine in her that set her apart from the world he had learned to distrust. She wasn't acting out of obligation. She was here because she truly wanted to thank him, because she admired his selflessness. "I don't know what to say," Elijah admitted, his voice shaky. Sophia stepped closer, her eyes softening. "You don't have to say anything, Elijah. I just wanted you to know that what you did meant more than you can imagine. I want to give you something. Anything you need, just say the word." Elijah recoiled slightly, instinctively pulling back. He wasn't used to accepting gifts or help. It made him uncomfortable, and part of him didn't feel worthy of it. "No," he said firmly, shaking his head. "I didn't do this for anything in return. I didn't want anything from you." Sophia's smile never faded, though there was a hint of sadness in her eyes. "I know you didn't, but that's what makes you different from everyone else. You gave without expecting anything in return. That's something rare, something beautiful." Her words were like a balm to his soul. Elijah didn't know how to process the kindness she was offering. It wasn't just about saving her life. It was about the deep, quiet understanding she had of him, a man who had lived in the shadows and had always kept his distance from the world. Sophia's admiration for him was clear, and though it made him uncomfortable, it also stirred something within him that he hadn't felt in years: hope. Elijah sat there, stunned, as Sophia continued to speak. The luxury of her words and the warmth in her gaze felt like a dream, one he had never imagined in his wildest hopes. Everything he had known, the cold streets, the sleepless nights, the empty days, had been his reality for so long that he could hardly fathom what Sophia was offering. But there it was, like a lifeline thrown from a world he had always been on the outside of, never daring to touch. Sophia leaned forward slightly, her eyes not just full of admiration, but genuine respect. "Elijah," she began, her voice steady but with a sense of urgency, "you've proven to me that you're more than just your circumstances. You saved my life when you didn't have to, and I've thought a lot about what that means. And I've come to realize that you have a strength and a heart that the world often overlooks. But I don't want you to be overlooked anymore." Elijah couldn't speak. The words he had heard, the kind of life she was suggesting, were foreign to him. What was she saying? Was she really offering him a chance to step out of the shadows? Sophia continued, sensing his hesitation. "I want to offer you something that could change your life, Elijah. I want to help you, not just with a thank you. I want to give you a chance. I want you to come work for my family. We need someone like you. Someone who can be part of something bigger." Elijah blinked, his heart racing. "Work? For your family?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper, as if he couldn't quite process the idea. He had spent his life trying to survive, and the idea of working for someone like her, the very people who had always seemed so far out of reach, felt impossible. Sophia smiled softly. "Yes. We need someone like you, Elijah. Not just for your strength, but for your integrity, your ability to see the world differently. You've done something that most people would never do, and I believe that kind of courage should be rewarded. So..." Her words washed over him, stirring emotions he had long buried. He never thought he would hear such things from someone like Sophia, someone so far removed from his reality. But here she was, offering him a path, a lifeline that could change everything. As if reading his mind, Sophia added, "And that's not all. I want you to have a place to live. I can't stand the thought of you out here, struggling when you deserve so much more. I'll arrange for you to stay in one of our properties, somewhere safe, somewhere you can call home." Elijah's breath caught in his throat. A home? A real home. For the first time in years, the thought of not having to sleep on the cold streets, of having a bed to sleep in, felt like an impossible dream. Sophia continued, seeing his disbelief. "It's not just about a roof over your head. It's about giving you a chance to start fresh, to have a place where you can feel safe and begin to build the life you deserve." The weight of her words settled into Elijah's chest, and he struggled to hold back the flood of emotions that threatened to overwhelm him. He had spent years living with nothing, fighting to survive each day, and now here was an opportunity, a chance for something more, something real. Sophia's voice grew quieter, but her words were full of conviction. Elijah, I see more in you than just a homeless man. You're not just the person who saved me. You're someone who has been through hardship and still managed to stay true to yourself. I want to give you a chance to prove that there's more to your life than survival. You have potential, and I believe you can do something great. Elijah stared at her, his mind racing. What was she saying? A chance to prove himself? A chance to build a new life? It seemed so far out of reach, yet there she was, offering him exactly what he had always hoped for. But the fear still lingered. Could he really do it? Could he really step into a world he had never belonged to, one that seemed so foreign? Sophia didn't wait for him to answer. We'll start small, she said. You don't have to jump into everything all at once, but this is your chance, Elijah. A chance to get off the streets, a chance to create a future for yourself. I want to help you build that future. No one should have to live like you've been living. Elijah felt the tears prick his eyes. This was more than just an offer of work or a place to stay. This was a chance to finally leave behind the life he had known, to escape the shadow of poverty and desperation that had held him captive for so long. Elijah took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, but the flood of emotions was too much. He had lived his whole life believing that no one cared, that he was invisible. And now, here was someone who saw him, who not only saw him, but valued him, and wanted to help him become something more. He looked up at Sophia, his voice cracking. I don't know what to say. I never thought someone like you would even notice someone like me. Sophia reached out, placing a hand on his shoulder. That's the thing, Elijah. People like you, people with a heart, with integrity, don't get enough recognition. But I see you, and I want to help you find your way. I want you to know that you're worth more than just your circumstances. You have something special. Her words were like a balm to his soul. He had always thought he was defined by his past, by his struggle. But now, for the first time in a long time, he felt like there was something more for him, a future beyond survival. And it was within reach. Elijah nodded slowly, still in disbelief. I don't know if I deserve all this, but I'll try. I'll try my best. Sophia smiled warmly, the kind of smile that made everything feel possible. That's all I ask. This was it, the turning point in Elijah's life. He had always been a survivor, fighting for the next day, but now, for the first time, he had the chance to live, to thrive, and to build something new. This was more than a job offer. It was an opportunity to reclaim his life. The days following the visit from Sophia and her family felt like a blur for Elijah. At first, it was hard to believe that everything was real, but as time passed, the opportunity she had promised began to take shape in his life, slowly transforming his reality. He moved into the spacious apartment that Sophia had arranged for him. It was a far cry from the cold, cramped shelters he had known. There were no more sleepless nights on the hard ground, no more struggling to find a safe corner to rest. The warmth of a real home was something he had never imagined, let alone dreamed of. Elijah's days began to take on structure. He started working for Sophia's family, taking on a job that gave him purpose and direction. It wasn't an easy start. He had a lot to learn and adjust to. But with every task he completed, Elijah felt a sense of accomplishment that he had never experienced before. His job wasn't glamorous at first, but it didn't matter. For the first time in a long while, Elijah felt like he was building something for himself. He worked hard, his mind sharpened by the desire to prove that he was worthy of the life that was now unfolding before him. The job gave him not just a paycheck, but a renewed sense of dignity. He also started to reconnect with his lost dreams. The things he had long buried in the struggle for survival, his love for reading, his interest in business, and even his hope for a better future, slowly began to resurface. Elijah realized that he was not the same person he had been. The journey from homelessness to hope was not an easy one, but it was his journey. Elijah's physical transformation was just as profound. He took better care of himself, starting to look healthier, stronger, and more confident. But it was the internal changes that were the most striking. He no longer defined himself by his past struggles. He no longer saw himself as a victim of circumstance, but as someone with potential, someone who was capable of much more. Throughout this transformation, Sophia was there for him. Their relationship grew beyond the initial gratitude she felt for him, saving her life. She became a close friend, someone who supported him as he navigated this new world. They would often talk late into the night, discussing everything from the meaning of life to the challenges they both faced in their worlds. Sophia never treated him like someone beneath her. Instead, she saw him as an equal, as someone who had earned her respect, not just for saving her, but for his character, his resilience, and his drive to succeed. She became a mentor of sorts, offering guidance and advice when Elijah needed it, but also respecting his independence and his need to prove himself on his own terms. Elijah grew to admire Sophia deeply, not just for her kindness, but for her understanding of the world. Unlike the cold and distant people he had known before, she never took her wealth for granted. She was grounded, aware of the struggles of others, and committed to making a difference in the world. Their bond became a friendship rooted in mutual respect, and Elijah began to feel like he belonged to something bigger than himself. Sophia was not just the millionaire's daughter. She was someone who believed in second chances, who believed that people could change if given the opportunity. She had given Elijah that chance, and in doing so, she had changed his life forever. Months later, Elijah stood at the window of his new apartment, looking out at the city below. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the buildings. It was a view he had never thought he'd have, and yet here he was, looking at a future full of promise. He had come a long way from the cold streets, from the desperate days when he had only one goal, to survive. Now he had goals that stretched far beyond mere survival. He wanted to succeed. He wanted to give back. He wanted to help others who were in the same position he had been in. And then, as if on cue, there was a knock at the door. Elijah opened it to find Sophia standing there, her usual warm smile lighting up the room. "I brought lunch," she said, holding up a bag with takeout. Elijah smiled back, feeling a warmth inside that had nothing to do with the physical surroundings. "Come on in," he said, gesturing for her to enter. They sat together, eating and talking as they always did. The conversation flowed easily, full of laughter and shared experiences. And in that moment, Elijah realized just how far he had come. Not just in terms of his life situation, but in terms of who he was. Sophia had helped him rebuild his life, but she had also shown him something more important. She had shown him that kindness, bravery, and doing the right thing always come back in unexpected ways. Her act of gratitude had changed the trajectory of his life, and in turn, Elijah was determined to make the most of it. As the conversation continued, Elijah knew that his journey wasn't over. He still had much to learn, much to give, and much to achieve. But for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid of the future. He had learned that no matter how hard life could be, there was always room for change, for growth, and for hope. And that was all he needed to move forward. The final message was clear. Elijah's transformation was not just about a change in circumstance. It was about the power of kindness, the courage to do the right thing, and the unexpected ways life could turn around when least expected.